This person got 30 certifications. This is wild. I've never seen anything like this before. Cloud resumes. Today's video, we're going to be talking all about the resume for the cloud industry. Now this session is called Job Market for a reason, and that will become a little bit more apparent as we get a bit further into the video. In terms of breaking things down, the first part that we'll talk about is how to think like a hiring manager, how to look at your resume like a hiring manager would and understand what hiring managers are actually looking for when it comes to reviewing resumes for the cloud industry. Then part two, we're going to talk about some real resume examples. I've got 3 resumes from actual people in the cloud industry that we're going to break down, and we're going to look at the things that they're doing well, the opportunities that they're leaving on the table, and then in part 3, we'll go through some Q&A. So you've actually submitted some questions about cloud resumes, and we'll go through those at the end. Anyway, let me get into it. So who am I? If you haven't seen the last video, I'll do a quick recap. So my name is Lou. I have been coding and working in the tech industry for over 10 years now. And I'm currently a product manager in the cloud developer tooling space. And one of the things I like to do a lot is just help people get into the cloud industry. That's what I do here through Open Up the Cloud. And you can find me on lots of different social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, here on YouTube. Now this video is actually part of the AWS Free Cloud Bootcamp. If you're watching this video and you're not from the bootcamp, that's absolutely fine. Everything that we cover today will also be applicable regardless of if you're doing that bootcamp or not. Now this is part of a few videos that I'll be doing on cloud careers throughout this bootcamp that will be published here on YouTube. This is the second of those. So we've already done one last time, which was talking about job titles and how to understand different job roles in the market, talking about resumes today, and then we've got a few more sessions as well before the bootcamp ends. So if you want to go back and have a look at that last section about roles, and that'll explain everything about all the different roles in the cloud industry if you're still uncertain about which job you want within the cloud. We talked about, exactly which different roles, how to find roles that you're a good fit for, and how to pick skills that align with that role and build your own learning plan to go towards it. But since these sessions are not actually over, you can still submit Q&A questions as well. Go to openupthecloud.com/bootcamp survey, and you'll get a survey there where you can drop in Q&A questions for future sessions. Now, let's jump into it. And actually, I wanted to start today with a story that actually will be the subtext for a lot of the things that we talk about a little bit later. And this goes a little bit into my past, which was working with kids as a camp counselor. And it has something to do with table tennis. So it was one afternoon that we were off in our break room on the camp itself, and I was there with the athletics director and a couple of other people who were playing table tennis. Now, the way that I had always treated getting better at things like sports was very much focusing on myself, my own abilities. Let's say if you were learning to become a footballer, my approach to that would be, okay, well, I'm going to go out there and practice all of those skills. I'm going to go take a ball to the park, learn how to do keep-ups, and I'm going to try and get better and use my skills that way. But what he was doing was actually assessing the people that I was playing. So the person at the other side of the table, he would watch them and go, did you see that? If you watch, that person on their backhand was super weak. So if you play the ball to that side, you're going to end up winning. And at this point, I realized that I'd kind of been doing sports wrong my entire life, where I'd been focusing very much on myself and my own skills, rather than thinking about how do I play to an opponent? How do I play to another team within that context? That was something that I just never did. I never thought about sports in that way at all. Because getting into cloud is very much like getting good at playing sports. You don't win by doing skills and drills in isolation, by doing, going and taking Udemy courses or taking another certification. You actually win in this industry by working out the market. What are you up against? What do employers want from you? What do hiring managers want from you? And then you've got to work out strategies that play to the market. Now, this is something that marketers, people in sales have known for a long time. And there's so many frameworks out there that these different marketing type of people use. But this is one that I've always found particularly useful, which is called the one-sentence persuasion. Now, within marketing, the people say that you can actually convince anyone to do anything if you can convince them of these 4 different dimensions. Now, the reason that I mention this in a talk about resumes is this is a great way of building empathy and understanding what hiring managers might actually want from you. So to take the context of a cloud resume, when it comes to encouraging dreams, what does a hiring manager want? They want to see that you're proficient in the tech stack that's very specific to them. Failures, they might have hired people in the past, maybe people that had lots of certifications on their resume, but they weren't as, they were slow to onboard or something like this. When it comes to fears, they might be thinking that, maybe you need a lot of teaching. If you're someone that's new to the industry, one of their fears is they will bring you on board and it's going to take a long time for you to ramp up and learn skills. So the best thing that you can do is actually play to that and show that that's not necessarily the case. and throw rocks at their enemies. They might think that you're all certifications but no practical experience. Or they might confirm their suspicions. If you've worked in the industry before or in a different sector, their suspicion might be that you're only capable of working in that specific capacity. Now, this is the first piece of homework that I actually would like you to do today before we get into the resume part. And that's I want you to try and develop empathy and understanding for what hiring managers might be thinking about when it comes to hiring you. So think about what are the sort of hopes, dreams, and aspirations that hiring managers might have, but also start to think about yourself, think about your own skills, think about your own background, and start to anticipate what might be the questions that I might get asked, and what specifically are the ways that they might object to my experience. What are the glaring gaps and opportunities that I need to make sure that I put into my resume? Now, a lot of people, when they're in the job hunt, they go to Google and put in questions like, I don't know, how to get a job as a cloud engineer. But what an interesting angle that you can do is actually go and search for information like a hiring manager would. Now, if you want to become a cloud engineer, let's say, go to Google and type in how to hire a cloud engineer. It's really interesting. It's very fascinating. You'll get an in-depth understanding of how the hiring process works, what they're looking for in different candidates, how they're potentially going to assess them, what type of questions they're going to ask. Okay, so I said that I was going to give you this lens, this way that you can actually start to view things as a hiring manager. So I actually want to go ahead and show you a resume template that I've seen passed about on the internet a few times, and actually I had an immediate knee-jerk response when seeing this. So here we go. I'll throw up the template for you to take a look at. I'll just pause for a second so you can have a look and scan. I'm just curious, if you're the hiring manager for this resume, what are your immediate thoughts? Think back to that empathy mapping exercise. What are your fears? What are your doubts about this individual? What do you think about them? What are the main things that you're taking away while looking at this resume? So the first thing I notice here is the summary information. The summaries are a great opportunity within your resume to tell a story. Now, if you have more experience than other people, if you're coming across from an adjacent industry, having a summary in your resume is vitally important because it's going to give you the opportunity to explain your story, explain what type of role that you're looking for, to highlight strengths, to highlight everything that you want to draw the attention to of the person reading your resume. Now, as I stepped through this and I was looking at it, second thing that I see here is education. Straight away, my immediate response to that was, is this person inexperienced? Why is there no work experience on this person's resume? Are they putting education first for that reason? That was my immediate assumption. That was my guess from the information they gave me. Moving further down, and we have certifications. Okay, I'm starting to get my assumption validated here. Education, certifications is obviously very important to this person, but now I'm starting to wonder, does this person have practical experience? Does this person have any work experience? Why are they putting education so high? And then we have projects. Projects then appear next on the resume. Again, this to me is starting to tell me that this person doesn't have a lot of work experience, and if they're not lucky, potentially I'm going to put this resume into the sift pile and then move on to the next one. Because this doesn't look to me like a very professional resume. It looks like someone who has a lot of educational background maybe. Let's go ahead and actually just restructure this a little bit. So let's pull work experience up. Let's move technical projects down. Let's definitely move education and certifications a bit further down on this resume. You might have actually caught as well that they mention certifications in the summary at the top. Now this is a good way of highlighting those certifications or your education background if you want to, without having a whole section dedicated to certifications. Now what I'm talking to you about here is something that has been or is very obvious to people that work in the UX field, and that's this idea of content hierarchy. It's very important when it comes to your resume is structuring it in terms of what you want to draw the attention of the reader to. What are the important points? What are the things that you want to take away? Now, I found this funny infographic about content hierarchy. Again, I'll pause just for a second just so you can have a look at it, because this is the kind of thing that your brain is doing when you read a resume, when you're like observing a resume as a hiring manager would. Now, if you followed it like most people, as you're reading that text, it's kind of funny, right? Because you read each piece of text and then you start actually realizing that they knew exactly where you were going to read next. And that's the thing, we're drawn to bolded, to titles, to things like that. And that's where I want you to focus most of your energy on first is the categories, the titles, the headings, the things that you're drawing the attention to, the summary at the top of your resume. So part of your homework today, if you've got a resume created, follow this exact process. Go step by step from the top of your resume, the things that you're showing in the most prominent position. Now, one thing that I'm always talking about when it comes to the resume itself is this idea of credibility. Now, the main thing is your resume wants to show to the employer that they can trust that you can do the job. So when it comes to structuring your resume and what comes first, I want you to be thinking very strongly about this idea of credibility. We touched on this in the last video, but I want to just explain it again, which is often your credibility from your experiences comes from a combination of two things. That is the barrier to entry. How difficult is this experience to obtain, and the depth of evidence that you're showcasing from that experience. So let's take some examples. Let's take the AWS Associate Developer exam. Now, if you've got taken that, the level of barrier to entry to landing that certification, well, actually you only need about $75. You can take the certification. If you have a basic level of understanding of AWS, you can land that certification. Let's say, a degree from Harvard University. Of course, Harvard is actually notoriously difficult to get into, so the barrier of entry into Harvard is quite high. Let's take a GitHub project. So a GitHub project in terms of evidence depth, it depends what you've done. If you just copied the hello world from an application, the depth of evidence that you'll have there is probably not that high. Or, potentially the barrier to entry there is then also not that high for a project. So some things that you can think about, we'll talk about a little bit later, is how you can take a project and build more depth of evidence into that, how you can build more credibility from the projects that you've got. Now, if we take professional experience, let's say you got into Google. Of course, this is like on the highest end of the scale. This is the highest level of evidence that you could build, and there's a lot of depth that comes from this as well, and the barrier to entry is quite high. So professional experience obviously is one of the highest forms of credibility you can have, but some of these other things, certifications and projects, can help plug the gap, can help us to build the credibility that we need. We should be thinking about how can we take that certification, how do we move it up on this chart? How do we build more depth of evidence? Now, one thing that you could do if you've got an associate level certification, you could go and take a professional one. That's certainly going to showcase a little bit more depth of evidence, and they're also a little bit harder to obtain. So that's one way you can push yourself up on this credibility matrix. Well, let's say taking a project, something like the AWS Cloud project that you're doing right now. What can you do to increase the credibility of this experience to an employer? Now, a couple of non-conventional things that I'm often talking about is working in a team. When it comes to working in a company context, you're going to be collaborating with others and working in a team quite a lot. So if you can showcase that from your projects, that will transfer over. Also, stakeholders. This is vitally important. If you can add a stakeholder into some of the projects that you're building, that it can be incredible, because exactly in a work context, you will have stakeholders. You'll have a boss. You might have a customer or a client that's setting the requirements for the project that you're working on. Now, a lot of people get caught up on this because they think, well, how do I find a stakeholder? Do I need a job for that? Well, not necessarily, because the projects that you can build, you can go out and find a stakeholder that's within your personal network, a family friend, someone that you know who owns a business, something that you can build a small proof of concept for. It doesn't matter whether or not they exchange money for it, but if you have that experience working with the stakeholder, you can document that process, and that can form great evidence to go down on your resume, which massively increases your credibility. So, next exercise that I want you to do is go through your resume. Start to chop up those different things that you have. The degree, if you have a degree, any past certifications, education, different work experience, and start to plot them on that chart. Start to think about what is the depth of evidence that I'm showcasing, and how difficult is this to obtain, and what can I potentially do to pull those further up and showcase and demonstrate more credibility for the job that I'm applying for. Now, for some of you, that's very theoretical. I understand that. That's why exactly I want to take some concrete examples. So let's go ahead and jump in and look at some literal resumes. We're going to take these apart using the context that we've already got about how to view a resume as a hiring manager would, and some of the things that they would be looking for. So this is the first resume I'm going to throw up. If you want to, pause the video, have a quick look at this, have a think about what you think about this resume. And if not, we're going to jump in and then have a look and then see what I think of this one as well. So let's take it again, top to bottom, and work through it. First of all, the thing that pops out to me here is we have got an image on this resume. I wouldn't include a picture whatsoever. It's just distracting, and it's definitely not something that a lot of Western companies would expect whatsoever. But of course, depending on your area, you might want to double check just to make sure that that's not the case. But in my case, I would say I would not be including an image on a resume. The second thing is they've got a few links up here to different evidence. That's great. We talked about this, credibility, showcasing evidence. This person has put some links here, let's say to GitHub. Hopefully if I go to their GitHub portfolio, that they've got some sort of README that showcases where I should look. They've got some starred repositories that point me to some things that they're really proud of on that GitHub. That would be very useful as well. Now, the first thing that stuck out to me as well, again, I'm missing the overview. This happens a lot. Use that overview to tell the story about what type of role that you want and what are the main things you want the employer to know about you. Highlight the best things that you've got on your resume, those high credibility things. So this person has put their most recent job. It's nice to see professional experience appearing there. If you have it, certainly at the top. However, what's interesting is we don't have a lot of context or information about this role. So this is kind of an odd use of this priority real estate. We're kind of wasting this opportunity here. We could have added a lot more information about what that role was and some of the background and the history. I'm not going to talk about formatting of resumes today, but this is kind of odd. There's this huge chunk of white space. It's distracting. It's taking away your attention. Again, content hierarchy. Where do you want my focus to be? Where do you want the reviewer to be looking when they're looking at your resume? Certainly not into this white space off to the left-hand side of this resume. And so what we've got here is we actually got two roles working in this Sharp Records company. But we don't see any necessary progression here. They move from automation engineer to DevOps engineer. It's not obvious looking at those titles whether this person was promoted or not, or whether that was progression, or how they actually transferred between those roles. That's the kind of thing I would like to see in an overview. You know, why did they move between those roles? And they moved from quality assurance into automation into DevOps. That's a very interesting progression now I've read it, but that would be nice to see that in the summary. So this person is coming from a quality assurance background. They're now looking for more of an automation or a DevOps. I would love to know, how did you transition between those? What was the motivation? Like, where is your career going now? What are you looking for in the next step? Those are the kind of things you could add into the summary at the top of the resume. So let's go and add that in here. So one of the nice things we saw from that was some of that hard evidence linking off to GitHub. But let's go ahead and take one of those paragraphs from one of those jobs and have a zoom in and see what we can see. So like I say, this one mentions automation engineer at Sharp Records. And so we say senior automation engineer with full system development lifecycle experience, including designing, developing and implementing test frameworks, plans, cases, and processes, fueling swift corrective actions and consistent quality improvement. Now, the first thing that stands out to me here is we've got no specific technology. So they say they're an automation engineer and they mention a lot of sort of concepts and ideas, but they don't say which tech they're actually working with. That would be quite useful to know. What technologies are you proficient in? What's your specialisms? What's the areas that you have a depth of understanding in? They mentioned implementing test frameworks. I'm left thinking, but which framework? Which framework specifically? So adding those specifics in there can be really useful. And they mentioned swift corrective actions and consistent quality. Now these are useful because we're talking about the impact that you actually had. However, in this case, there's no figures or data to back that up. So when it comes to adding these descriptions into your work experience or even into your project experience, think about the impact that you had. Think about the data. That could be, components that you refactored or money that you saved for the company that you're working for. Think about the impact, the tangible outcomes that you had from your work. Okay, let's have a look in resume 2. So again, I'll throw this one up here for you. You can have a look through, have a look again. What do you think? What are these sections telling you? What is your immediate response to this resume? What are the things that the questions that you would ask this candidate? What are the things that you think they're weak on? And where are the opportunities here? So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and have a look at these. So first up, again, we're leading with certifications. Very common. I see this all the time. But we also don't have a summary. So this person's missed the opportunity to put a summary in, and they're putting certifications front and center at the top of the resume. My immediate response to that is this person potentially inexperienced? Does this person have work experience? Why are certifications appearing as the first thing that they're showcasing here on the resume? So if you want, put certifications into the summary, but I wouldn't necessarily have a dedicated section for them. Okay, so now we jump into work experience. This is better than some of the other ones we saw earlier on, where work experience is buried further down. If you've got relevant work experience, for sure, that should be one of the highest things. It's one of the highest credibility signals that you have, so put that higher up on the resume. Okay, so we've got, again, education and certifications. I don't know, we have 2 sections for certifications. We're so excited about them. And then we talk about projects, but not a lot of context. What is this project? What were you building? How big is it? Were you building it for a stakeholder? Were you building it as a team? Is it you on your own? We're missing that context about what this project actually is. And when you say projects, you can't necessarily assume that an employer even knows what project even means. It's a very ambiguous term. So we need to specify in there, what is that exact experience? What does that actually mean? What are the outcomes that you created in that? What were the things that you did? Projects are a great way of building experience that can plug gaps in your resume. However, if you're not careful, you end up with a resume that looks a little bit like this. We have a small bit of work experience, maybe it's not even specific to the role that you're applying for, and this big old section of projects, which immediately when you're scanning that as a hiring manager is going to give you a tell this person is not that experienced and they're trying to compensate with some of those projects. So what can you do? How do you get out of that trap? How do you stop yourself looking like more inexperienced, and what can you do in terms of structure? So one thing that you can do is take your work experience or take that experience section, and then rather than have it as just purely professional experience, thinking, the only thing that counts here is a full-time job, and then have that as experience, and underneath that you can have the different categories. So projects, if you worked on open source, let's say, if you've got other professional experience, you can then group those together and give them some of the credit that they deserve, because the project work that you're doing is real experience. So by having it in a separate experience, a separate section to work experience, is you're kind of downplaying that experience as well. So something to consider. You might want to structure your resume in that way. And then lastly, an important point here is talking about actual tech skills and where tech skills appear on the resume. So this person's put a separate section right at the bottom of their resume summarizing some of the tools that they are proficient in. Now, this is quite common to have like a summary of different tools and things like that. Now, I actually would advise against that. What I would say is what is better is to talk about the technology that you've used within the contexts. Visually, that looks a little bit like this. So instead of having tech, where you have a separate section for tech and then experience separate, take that and actually embed those tech bits into your experience. So you can highlight those, you can call those out specifically under the different bits of experience on your resume. Adding those tech labels in on their own, like anyone can do this. Anyone can just list off a whole bunch of different technology. As a hiring manager, this makes it very hard to understand what experience does this person have specifically with this technology. So just having a whole list of technology isn't super useful. Again, you can use the summary for that if you want to highlight specialisms, if you want to highlight specific technology that you are quite good at. Use the summary for that. Don't necessarily have a tech section dedicated just to listing off a whole bunch of different technology. Okay, so let's take this section then and actually zoom in and have a look. Now, straight away, one thing that I really like about this is they talk about stakeholders. Again, if you can incorporate stakeholders into your project, that's one way that you can really start to stand out. Because if you just have projects where you've built them alone, yourself, on your own, not in a team context, that is less credible than if you can find ways to incorporate stakeholders into your work, even if they are non-paying or it's, someone that's a family or friends. But in this case, they said, they've worked with 20 clients. That's interesting. This work experience then is client-facing, customer-facing. They must have used communication, things like that involved in that. That's a big plus point. Tech. Again, we're embedding tech into the experience. That's useful. Now I know that they've used CloudFormation and SAM and GitLab CI within the context of this work experience. I know how long they've used that technology for and what the broader context around it is, which allows you as a hiring manager to better understand that experience and how credible that is towards the job that you're hiring them for. Okay, so that was resume 2. Let's have a look now at resume 3. Now this one's quite small, might be hard to see. Pause the video if you want to have a look, but if not, we'll actually zoom in on these different sections. Okay, so zooming in on section 1. First things first, this is, okay, we have the summary, which is good. We talked about that before, but again, content hierarchy. There's way too much content here. It's very hard to know what specifically this person wants to draw the attention to and what is the important information here. So let's go ahead and just have a quick read. So they mentioned at the start, experience delivering from POC and pilot to production scale deployments. They said they're working with AWS consulting. They mentioned they're an AWS Restart graduate. They're a holder of 30 certifications. We'll get onto that in a second. Attendee of local community events. Right. There's a lot of information here, but there is no story. There is no coherence between these. These are just, it's like a collection of sort of random things that this candidate wants to put forward. You really want to think about what is the important part? What is the story that you're trying to explain here? Don't just repeat information that might appear further down in the resume. Add some additional context to that as well. So we got stuff in here. We could move this to education. We got Restart graduate. That can come underneath. We got like attending community events. This is great. Getting involved in the community is awesome, but probably not something I would necessarily highlight in the summary section in this way. Mentoring women in tech, that's amazing. Mentoring other people, that's amazing. But it would be nice as well if we're talking about the outcomes. What are the outcomes? Did you achieve? Did those people land jobs? What was the impact on them? That would be really nice to know here as well, rather than just listing things that you participated in. Like I said, rather than looking at things that you did, start to think about what did you achieve? What was the outcome? What was the benefit? Again, so we have another big list of technology. Again, I would say incorporate this into your experiences rather than having specific giant lists of technology. This makes it hard. Like, what is your specialty? What is the areas of, so what are the things that you've used recently versus in the past? What are the things that you're good at? What are the recurring technologies that you've worked with? Last section we have is an overload of certifications. This person got 30 certifications. This is wild. I've never seen anything like this before. Apart from that, it's an incredible achievement. But again, this comes back to the very first point that I was making here. It's very important that you start to understand what is impressive and important to hiring managers. Now here, this just looks like this person just really likes taking certifications. This doesn't necessarily show that they're good for the specific job that they're applying for. 2, 3, 4, 5 certifications are fine. If you have more, that's great, but I wouldn't really be taking up this amount of real estate on your resume when you're talking about certifications. Okay, so we've had a quick look at some of those resumes, had a look at some common traps, some tips and advice about how to restructure those and things that you should be looking out for. But let's have a quick look at some of the questions that you submitted and potentially how they relate to some of the stuff that we already talked about. So one of the questions was how to properly grade my skills in the resume, how to assess a skill level. 1 to 5 scale is so subjective. 100% is very subjective. So if you're wondering what this person's talking about, is they're talking about things like this. It's quite common in tech resumes for people to highlight skills and then add like this rating thing to it. It's like 1 to 5 or like 1 in 10 rating. For me, this is in the same category as dedicated skill sections. I don't advise doing this. The rating certainly doesn't add anything. If anything, it's just distracting. Like, why, for instance, are you not competent in all of the skills? How are you even rating that? The person, sort of said in the question, it's subjective. 100%, very subjective. Definitely wouldn't recommend this as a practice. Again, think about credibility. Think about, what depth of evidence you showcase in here. Just by listing off skills doesn't necessarily signal credibility to the employer. So that's one thing we want to be thinking about. Okay, another question. What do you think impresses recruiters the most about a full stack? So this is the same question that we had before. Specifically about full stack though, that was my route into the industry. So if you want to, I actually did a video talking actually in a lot more detail about what I did specifically to land a job as a full stack developer in the tech industry many years ago now. But it talks about some of the projects that I built, how I built those projects, and how I targeted my learning around the mean stack, which was Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. Those are skills that were really complementing each other at the time. They were massively demanded in the market, and I focused my entire job hunt on those specific skills. So everything that I'm talking about today is also what helped me land my own job, and it's exactly what I did. How do we write about this bootcamp experience in our resume, and how would you speak about it in interviews? Depending on the amount of experience you've got, you might want to consider restructuring your resume so that you highlight some of your project experience under an experience category rather than having it as separate. That's one thing to think about. But also think as well about like, how can you increase the credibility of this project? Don't just take what Andrew has given you, or if you're following any course or project online, don't just take what the instructor gives you. Think about how you can add your own personality to that. How can you customize it? How can you do things that's going to increase that credibility? The things we talked about before. Maybe working in a team, finding other people to work alongside you or to assess your code. Those are going to make a difference. Adding stakeholders in, that will make a difference. Increasing the credibility is something that you want to do. And then you can take that and then talk about that when it comes to the interview and represent it like we just mentioned as well. Remember as well, call out the tech that you've got specifically that you used within that project. How to frame my resume to make it appropriate for cloud roles. I would say, first of all, go watch the first video, because it's very important that you understand which role you're going for first. Your entire resume should be structured around landing one specific role. You should have a good idea of the type of skills that you're building and the role that you're going for. Without that foundation, without that goal, that end result, it's going to be very difficult for you. How to format resume when switching careers to cloud, but not new to IT. So if you've got an IT background, but coming into the cloud industry, it's a great question. Now, the main thing that I would say for people that are coming from IT into the cloud is that you probably already have a lot of other skills in those other areas like communication, teamwork, that type of thing. Don't downplay a lot of the transfer that you got from that, but the main thing that you probably will need to work on is actually the cloud specific. So the main objections you're probably going to get is that you are too much focused on the previous role, or maybe people are skeptical that you have the level of understanding of the cloud that you need. So I would really emphasize that you double down on the cloud, on building these projects, this evidence that you got, certifications, so that you can bolster that on top of your past experience working in IT. Now, like I said, my experience is actually coming from a software engineering background, and there's a whole bunch of people online actually who have come through the support route. So if that is your background, go and check out some of these different channels and these people and look at how they made this transition as well. So we've got Caroline, Gwyneth, Rishab. I'll put links in the description as well to their channels, and I would really urge you to go and listen to some of their stories because they're very interesting about how they made the transition from cloud or IT into, from support or IT into the cloud industry as well. Another question, interesting one. How do you draw attention to your resume? I've applied to over 140 jobs and they've not even got a single interview. Okay, so if this is you, what I would seriously suggest that you do right now is actually pause what you're doing completely, because you really need to first now get some feedback. We talked about this last time. Not all feedback is useful, but certainly if you've submitted over 140 different resumes, what I would suggest is something is going wrong. Something is definitely going wrong. Something about your resume is potentially not in line with the jobs that you're applying for. You're disqualifying yourself for some reason, and you absolutely need to get some feedback very quickly. And I would probably suggest that you pause applying for any more jobs. 140 is a huge amount of jobs not to even land an interview from. So what I suggest that you start to do is start to try and get some feedback from that resume. Some of those people you've applied for, if you can get some answers from them, that's useful. If not, put that resume into some of the community and tell them which types of jobs you're applying for. Try to get some feedback from some other people. Something is going massively wrong if you're applying for that many jobs and then not landing any interviews whatsoever. So definitely a point where we want to get some feedback on that before you continue. How many projects to mention in your resume? What level of complexity should those be? That's the thing. Projects are great ways to fill gaps in your resume. So there's no magic number for the amount of projects that you should do or for the types of projects that you should necessarily do. You want to look at those job descriptions, look at those skills the employers are asking for, and make sure the projects then fit and align with those. Everything we talked about last time, building cohesive skills, building the learning plan, that's exactly what you want to do. I typically bias towards fewer projects. If given the choice, I would suggest 2, 3, maybe even one project is certainly better than having 4, 5, 6, 7 more like that, because they probably don't go to the depth of evidence that you actually need in order to land a job. So what projects are worth it? There's not a specific magic project. You have to look at how credible are you for those different skills that are listed, and then start to plug gaps. If you're missing experience and credibility in some of those skills, incorporate those skills into your projects. There's no magic answer there. Let's do a recap because we covered a ton of stuff through today. We started off talking about how can you assess your resume as a hiring manager, what are they looking for, how are they looking at your resume? And you want to be thinking, like I said at the start, don't just think about your own skills and your own resume. Start to build that empathy for the hiring manager. Do those exercises that we talked about, where you're building that empathy. You are mapping out what the hiring manager might be thinking about you for your resume. Go back and do that first exercise from the previous video, where we're going to be building sort of the direction for the role and the title. And then start to take your experiences and start to map them out onto that matrix that we talked about. So reminder as well, if you want to submit questions for any of the upcoming sessions, go to openupthecloud.com/bootcamp survey. And that's it. That's everything for today. Let's chat more in the Discord server. I'll be over there as well answering questions. If you've got your resume and you want to share it, or if you have follow-on questions, go ahead, ask me in Discord. I'll be in there, or find me on social media if you want. But otherwise, as always, I look forward to sharing your I Got the Job post. Keep pushing. The day will come where you land the job and everything that you've been working so hard towards, will become a reality. But otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. See you soon.